This letter to the Hebrews is considered one of the more important books of the New Testament because it has a very strong philosophy and theology to it that's not readily available in some of the other letters. But to be honest, it's a really hard one to relate to, at least from the standpoint of who it was designed to reach out to. Because it was directed at a large group of the early Christians, those who had previously been Jewish. And even within that group, there was some variety. There were those Jews who, even though they had become Christians, still followed the law and revered the temple. Those who said, well, we believe in a modified version of the law, much as Jesus did. Some of those who said, well, we believe the law is just simply something that's in the past. And then there were others still who were anti-law and anti-temple, very much so. But they were all Jewish. And the reason I say it's hard for us to relate to is because these were Jews who were now Christians and were persecuted for their faith, something we don't really experience at all. They were persecuted to the point where they were suffering and looking back nostalgically upon being Jews. That's not a phrase you're going to hear very often. But look at some of the people mentioned. Israelites fleeing from Egypt, individuals like Gideon, Samson, David, Samuel, the prophets. And the writer points out that there were many wonderful acts done by the Jews of the past because of their faith. But then he goes on to point out those Christians at that time who had a different experience. Christians like themselves who were taunted and whipped, put in chains, even prison, some stoned to death, some cut in two, some put to death by the sword. All those people, whether they were triumphant Jews or persecuted Christians, were witnesses to their faith in God, but especially their faith in God through Jesus Christ. And then there's this phrase, so great a cloud of witnesses. It's one we really like in the church to use for themes for even a General Assembly or something like that, because it makes us think a little bit about all the people that have gone before. But I'll have to tell you, I find it really hard to relate to some of these passages, like this one, where it talks about the biblical heroes, Gideon, Samson, David, or Samuel. I mean, I know they did wonderful things, but I just don't really connect with them as people. And hearing those stories, I'm not sure exactly how it informs my faith, except I see that most of them were flawed and found some way to overcome those flaws. But I realize that my own cloud of witnesses is very different from the ones that are found here, because we all have a cloud of witnesses that affect our faith and how we live out our faith in Jesus Christ. The earliest person that I can consider to be part of my cloud of witnesses was a priest named Father John. Now, I was born and baptized Catholic, but my mom got upset with the church fairly early on, and we became Catholic Light, which is Episcopalian. All the trappings, none of the guilt. Very much so. And I became an altar boy and did all those wonderful things. But my little brother was being baptized, and Father John had been made the godfather of my brother. Never exactly sure. I even called Mom the other day. I said, so why was? She goes, I can't really remember. It's been so long ago. But the reason I remember him is because of his laughter and his smile and his joy. He came over to the house after my brother's baptism, and he was in the backyard with the rest of us, sitting there in his black priest robes, but he was bouncing my little brother on his knee, laughing all the time. He showed us a game which was called, This is the Way the Lady Rides. But then it changes to gentleman and farmer, and progressively you're bouncing the child faster and faster on your knee until the child's flying up in the air. Now, my little brother loved it. Father John was laughing, and we've all been doing that to our children now for fast 50-some years. But it was his laughter and joy about church, just about being with people of God, that stuck with me first. And I have to say it's probably a good thing, because what came next as far as my cloud of witnesses was not quite so joy-filled. My faith was affected by 4 young Methodist pastors. By the time I started to hit high school, my father did a wonderful thing, which he's started to apologize now for many, many years later, which was to move from the area of South St. Paul, Minnesota, a fairly large area, and I went to a junior high of 1,500 people, I had like 398 people in my class. My father thought it would be a really great idea to move the family to a town of 695 people in northwest Iowa, not anywhere close to any metropolitan area. And now there were 33 people in my class. It was a bit of a culture shock, and the first thing I did was look for a church. Well, the problem was, small town Iowa, you didn't have Episcopal churches. There was Catholic, Lutheran, or Methodist. Take your pick. Well, being the one that was most involved in church, I started going to the Methodist church. My family soon followed. But it was Reverend Dave Nelson, our pastor there, that, together with 3 other pastors, really affected me. These were 4 young pastors who'd gone to seminary in the late 60s, so they were extremely social justice oriented. I mean, extremely so. Late 60s, you don't have to think about it very hard. And they, in fact, we didn't do Bible study. We had a book called The American Empire our youth group studied, talking about the ways our country had done things wrong in foreign countries. Well, that'll open your eyes when you're 16 or 17. But the thing about those 4 gentlemen was, it really impressed on me that even though you're living off somewhere in small town Iowa, they felt it was important that we know what was going on in the world, that we have a passion and that we have a concern for social justice. So that's something that's been stuck with me for many decades. And of course, too, I have to thank Reverend Dave for also introducing me to Jethro Tull. He said, "This is the best religious album you'll ever hear. It's called Aqualung." Oh, and it's quite a good one. It was a lot of years later before somebody else I can think of that really I could add to my cloud of witnesses, but no less important. Sue and I were living in Harrison, Arkansas. That's where she was a Christian educator, and I was program director at the radio station, and we had our first child, Kate. And the first year after being born, she stayed with one family during the day. But then we needed a little different daycare situation. We wanted someone that could watch her 3 days a week because we'd shuffled our schedules around. And finally, we found the perfect person. Her name was Ida Mae Mattingly. She had helped raise families of many prominent people there in the town, and she had decided that it was probably time for her to quit doing quite so many kids. Her latest role was being the nanny to 4 children of a family where she was doing 5 days a week, and she thought it was time to cut back a little bit. Ida Mae was 84 years old. 84 years old taking care of 4 kids. And now she decides to cut back, and we weren't exactly sure how well that was going to work with a small child. Until that day, I remember coming back from work, and we had what they call a Little Tykes Playhouse, one of these little plastic homes that's about this tall, child-sized. And Ida Mae's feet were sticking out the door. She was inside the playhouse with my daughter, and they were laughing and having a wonderful time. I couldn't get on the floor even then. But she could do it. And it was a joy to be around her. But the thing that was most impressive was I took her home every day after work, and we'd have a conversation as I helped her home to her apartment where she lived for many, many years. Also picked her up sometimes to take her to church with the church van, and we'd have some more conversation. But Ida Mae had been married once, but her husband had died shortly after they were married, and she'd never remarried. Of course, they'd always hoped she'd come there from Texas, which is another reason why we were a little concerned when we were there, because our daughter started to talk like Ida Mae. But she had never had that opportunity to have the family she wanted to have. And I remember thinking, what a rough deal she got. Lost her husband so young, never remarried, lived in this small but comfortable apartment, but for 50-some years. Never had a family of her own. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because there was never anybody that was so filled with gratitude for what she had received. All the people she'd had the opportunity to be part of their family, raising their children. The people at church and everything else that she didn't drive. She just had always walked whenever she needed to go, and she counted on the kindness of strangers. But she was someone that was filled with gratitude and joy in her faith. Made you think about the things you complain about a little bit more. Shortly after that, another person impacted my life in an unusual way, because Sue and I had both started exploring going to seminary, becoming ordained pastors. Whatever we were thinking, I don't know. But I was having a stop for a meal with a friend of mine. He was on the tennis team with me. His name was Chuck Gamber, and Chuck was a little older than the rest of the guys in the team, but he was a lot of fun, but kind of a gruff guy. I knew he was a staunch Catholic, and he was asking me, so what's going on with you? And I told him what we were doing, and immediately he says, yes, you need to do that. And I thought, well, honestly, Chuck and I, all we ever did was play tennis and play darts and drink beer while we played darts and after we played tennis. And I thought, well, but he then proceeded to tell me what qualities and what things he thought that I had that would make me right for ministry. And I think what surprised me most about that was not so much that he was saying it, but the fact that he observed it. The fact that he was so aware of the people around him that he could take that moment to offer up an opportunity to be an advocate for doing what I had hoped to do. I was sitting here looking back at all those people that we had then. Had the people with the social justice, the laughter and joy in church, the gratitude, that being aware of the people around you. Then Sue and I went off to seminary. And we had the joy of being some of the last students of a professor by the name of Burton Cooper. Now, Burton had written a book called Why God, because he had lost a child of his own, and he was a philosophical theologian. And he really worked us hard in seminary. He was one of those lovely professors that would say things to you like, well, you believe this then, right? Oh, yes. Well, that's great. Then that means you must believe this. Yeah. And then you must believe this. Well, no. He goes, if you believe this, you can't believe these other things because this is the first part that's wrong. And so if you don't believe that, you can't believe these other things. Oh. So it'd make you think over and over again about what it was you believed, how you think about God, which was good because it helped us avoid some of those terrible platitudes of how you think God works that sometimes are not very comforting things to tell people. But Burton shared with us in a way of examining our faith and always being open to listening to other people. Because as much as he had been, to this day, he sends us copies of his sermon. He delivers a sermon once a month at his local church. And he sends us a copy of the sermons, but he doesn't want us just to read them. We're supposed to read them and critique them. It's not, I'm always going, well, I'm one of your students. I know that, but come on, I want to hear your criticisms. He will not be happy if you don't criticize something. But he made us think about what it was we did with our faith. But then the last person that I'd put in my cloud of witnesses was someone by the name of Jeffrey Janes. Jeffrey showed up one time early on when we were in our church in New Jersey. Hadn't been there very long, and Jeffrey stuck out for a reason. Now, not because he was the only black person there in the congregation, and he was a large man, but because he'd grown up in an Italian neighborhood in the Bronx. He sounded like an extra from a Scorsese movie, one of the Goodfellas. And the thing about Jeffrey was, though, he would listen to your sermon and come up and then tell you about the things that he had gotten out of it that were positive, and just as often would come up and say, I don't know where you got this from. We need to talk about this. And he'd want to find out more and more about what it is we were saying. And he was the most engaged individual I've ever seen as a member of a congregation when it came to your sermons. We say that we like that, and we do, but I'm not sure if I could stand having, for instance, 150 people all doing the same thing. Might get to be a long day. But Jeffrey was a joy. And the interesting thing himself was he felt he was a preacher. And he was, but just an elder. But if you look in the Book of Order, it says elders are supposed to have that capability of preaching when needed to be. Just a little something for all you elders out there to keep in mind. Don't shake your head, Tim Hayden. Not gonna happen. But he had got some training at a lay pastor academy in New York City Presbytery. Plus, we worked with him too because he said he was always looking for ways to improve how he shared the gospel. Jeffrey was amazing. He'd gotten laid off by a major auto corporation and received a pretty good severance package. And the first thing he did, take 10% and give it to the church. Now, I knew Jeffrey was here. He'd been laid off. He leased his car, rented his condo. And I said, I don't know what kind of shape you're going to be in. Are you sure you want to give that 10%? He goes, oh, yes. Because nothing gave him more joy than being able to give to the church. And he said, it came to me now. This is that first fruits giving. I'm going to give it while I can. And do it right away. And it gave him so much. And I remember later on, as things got a little tighter for him, I said, are you sure you don't want some of that back? Nope. It meant so much for him to be able to do for the church. Jeffrey was probably one of the greatest joys in our lives as far as being ministers at that congregation. And it wasn't too many years before we left there, though, that he'd come down ill all of a sudden, out of nowhere, ended up in the hospital, and just a few days later died. But before he died, he'd asked for Sue, for me, and another elder to come visit him, and he talked to us each individually and told us all to keep it quiet and secret what he told us. Because he really had a charge to lay on each one of us. There is something about a dying human being, especially one that you know is very passionate about their faith, giving you a charge about what you're supposed to do in your life. So I look at those cloud of witnesses, and I recognize that, we can read our biblical stories, and it's important. There's so much to gain from reading the Bible and from discussions about it, but the reality is our faith is more impacted by the people we meet and the people who show us the way they live their faith. Now, none of us is ever going to be perfect. We had Jesus, that was enough. But all of us have elements within our faith and our lives that allow us to be part of that cloud of witnesses. I'm sure many of you, if you sat there and thought about it, could probably name a handful of people that had been most important upon your own faith development. But how many of you think of yourselves as being one of those clouds of witnesses? One of those individuals who might have made a difference in somebody else's faith? And sometimes it's not pastors or youth leaders or teachers. Sometimes it's just by the way you live out your faith through your ordinary living that will make an impact on somebody else. So for us, I think it's important to remember always that what we do and how we live can make people experience Jesus Christ in a whole new way. No one individual can be the kind of example that one person can be like Jesus, but together it's simple. The instructions are given to us there in Hebrews. It says, throw off any extra baggage, get rid of the sin that trips you up, and fix your eyes on Jesus. And be a witness to God. Amen.